A reading from Acts, chapter 19, verses 23 through 41. About that time no little disturbance broke out concerning the way. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the artisans. These he gathered together with the workers of the same trade, and said, Men, you know that we get our wealth from this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost the whole of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and drawn away a considerable number of people by saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is a danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned, and she will be deprived of her majesty that brought all Asia and the world to her worship. When they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! The city was filled with confusion, and people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Acoustics, Macedonians who were Paul's travel companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even officials of the province of Asia who were friendly to him sent him a message urging him not to venture into the theater. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward, and Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours all of them shouted in unison, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! But when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You have brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. If, therefore, Demetrius and the artisans with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges there against one another. If there is anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly. For we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. When he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. I step out onto the stage in front of a small crowd of tourists. I gave a short, impromptu speech about Greco-Roman architecture and stage a brief stage combat demonstration with a friend of mine. The crowd applauds. To make my voice hit the back of the wall of the outdoor amphitheater takes no more effort than preaching in my normal indoor chapel. What makes this remarkable is that the amphitheater in question is more than 2,000 years old and seats 25,000 people. The theater of Ephesus stands as a remarkable testament to ancient engineering. The Romans, in particular, prided themselves on their organization. Each city needed an amphitheater. The Greeks loved them so that they could perform plays, not as entertainment, but to feed the soul. The Romans perhaps needed less soul feeding. They liked plays just fine, but they also needed a place for gladiators to slaughter animals, fight each other, and massacre Christians. Per the Roman organization system, a Roman amphitheater needed to hold about 10% of the city's population. So, in a major metropolis like Ephesus, capital of the province of Asia, with a population of 250,000, they needed a 25,000-seater amphitheater. Started by the Greeks and brought to its present scale by the Romans, it demonstrates how well Greco-Roman culture understood acoustics. In a world without microphones, one person could address thousands with very little effort or training. In my travels over the past couple of weeks, I've stood in a half-dozen Greco-Roman stages, and each had this astounding quality: crystal clear amplification of the human voice, produced solely through architecture. This specific theater in Ephesus plays a leading role in this scene in Acts 19 of Paul versus the silversmiths. It's where they assemble, dragging along some of Paul's companions to continue their shouting of, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 whole hours. It's what allows one city official, an unnamed city clerk, to quiet down a crowd of thousands. He could use the acoustics to be heard over the din. Without it, that part of the story makes no sense. How did one single person, without a bullhorn, microphones, etc., overcome a chanting crowd? The ancient technology of the theater made it physically possible, but the local official had to stand alone in the face of that chanting crowd. No amount of technology makes that easy. They didn't even let Paul in there because the situation blew up into such a volatile wave of anger and confusion. The last guy that stood up, Alexander, got utterly dismissed, setting off the 2 hours of chanting. Here stood this city clerk, taking an unpopular stance with the people who paid his bills and who could trample him to death without a second thought. Over the past 11 days, I've traveled 15,000 miles, getting on 7 different flights, staying in 6 different hotels, and crossing between 2 countries. And technically 2 continents. Theoretically, we were chasing the footsteps of Paul, if somewhat in reverse. Corinth to Athens to Thessaloniki to Philippi to Iconium to Laodicea to Colossae to Hierapolis to Ephesus. What I kept coming back to at each site that we visited is that Paul's ministry was defined not by a lonely sojourn, but by relationships. We know some of their names: Barnabas, who came with him, Silas, Timothy, Luke, Titus, Lydia, the dye merchant from Philippi, Phoebe, who delivered the letter to the Romans, Philemon, the rich guy in Colossus, Gaius, and Andronicus, who got dragged in the theater. Many hundreds more get mentioned only by title: city clerk, church leader, elder, jailer, and so many of them don't get mentioned at all. We say that Paul built churches, but he erected no structures. In that world, having a prominent physical location would have just opened them up for easier attack. Instead, Paul built relationships, including some brave and unlikely allies. Paul's generation of the early church couldn't rely on their tools, existing relationships, and a legacy. None of those existed yet. They had to go out into their city and their world, use the tools like the theater of Ephesus and their hard-won allies to build a movement. Yes, the city clerk shows tremendous bravery, but that's not the only thing that should feel convicting. My journey with Paul reminded me how much they did with so little. Paul would arrive with just his tent-making tools and the clothes on his back, walking from place to place, and out of it would come a church community. I wonder what he would think of the modern church, with our vast resources, existing congregations, and huge legacies. How would he evaluate what we accomplish with so much versus what he and the early Christians did with so little? In our relative comfort, have we gotten complacent? Have we fallen in the trap of achieving very little while having so much? Our world contains plenty of people, places, and churches with Paul's level of zeal, scraping together whatever they can to make ministry happen. In examining ourselves, can we say the same?